Hello there, good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is that you tune into podcasts yourself. Thanks for coming back again to Songs of Ireland podcast. I'm Bill O'Brien, the host. We've got a few things to look at today. I've got quite an interesting program set out for you, spanning quite a long, quite a wide historical period. I'm going to have a look at embedded advertising, embedded product placements and advertising in Irish ballads and Irish music, which is quite an interesting. It was actually quite an interesting topic. I decided to go for this one because while reading through the schools collection and around a few village schools near where I live, I'd noticed that there's a poet called McMahon or Michael Mahon. I'm not 100% sure. The name seems to change here and there. Um, who seems to have been a transient bard, a transient poet that kind of passed through the Midlands of Ireland quite a lot, leaving songs wherever he was. I found a few of his songs, and he's someone that I'm gonna do a deeper dive into this guy McMahon or Michael Mahon, whatever his name was, because he seems like a very interesting character. He seemed to have got around an awful lot. I have a feeling he was a professional bard. I think he was someone who just kind of moved from town to town and had clients that he worked for. One of the poems that I found by him was quite local, had a really, really interesting story to it. So the area that he would have been writing in and active at the time, it's kind of the border between North and South Tipperary, around the Golden Vale area. Now, this historically and for quite a long time has been very, very much horse country. Race, even today, it's one of the biggest industries. Racehorsing and dairy is pretty much been the history of that particular area. So I've heard two versions of the story. The first of them, which is that in a pub he'd made a bet with the owner of the Hibernian Manure Company, which would have been a company collecting horse shit from stud farms, or perhaps a big stud farmer himself. And marketing it on as manure to farmers to use as fertilizer. So one version of this is that he'd had a bet with him that I bet I can write a song that can sell your horse shit. And another version I have, I'm taken straight from the school's archive. I'm going to read this out now. So, advertisement for the Hibernian Manure Company by Michael Mahon. The Hibernian Manure offered a prize of 2 guineas in open competition for the best advertisement for their manures. Michael Mahon, a local poet and a cooper by trade, was a competitor, and after keen competition was declared the winner. The setting for his pieces of poetry was a farmer's haggard, in which the farmer was industriously working, and a stranger had approached the gate, and who he'd soon recognised as a friend of his boyhood, but who had spent 20 years in exile. So this is the first version of Hibernian Manure that I have collected from the school's archives. They're both a bit different. So, God bless, the stranger cried, as he drew near the spot where Pat was turning up the soil to cultivate his plot. Welcome, sir, the farmer cried, and then he raised his eyes, and an old exiled friend of 20 years he soon did recognise. A warm welcome passed between as they grasped each other's hands, and talked of many matters o'er, of home and foreign lands. Where is the rushy valley, Pat? Where is the mossy dell? Where is the weedy garden, where we used to call it then? All these are banished long ago, they are now growing clover pure, thanks to the inventor of Hibernian manure. So that's one attempt. One thing I am thinking that could be a possibility here is the two poems came from the same competition that were written by different men. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I've got two versions of this poem that are quite separate. The other version I have from it is also from the Schools Collective. So both of these songs would have been known around the area and sung by people at the time. So I think they're both legitimate, real folk songs. Here's the second version of Hibernian Manure anyway. The stranger with his dog and gun went shooting o'er the hill, until he'd reached that little plot where Pat was toiling still. Upon the stile he sat to rest, to see Pat use his spade, and Mary shake the crop manure to every plant he'd laid. The stranger gazed in wild surprise. He had been city born, and never had experienced the working of a farm. What do you call that stuff you shake, so neat from end to end? 'Tis Hibernian's manure, sir, you may be sure. We call it the farmer's friend. Over 50 years I have suffered with this rank and barren soil, but lately I can raise a crop to pay me for me toil. And if I live a few years more, great riches I'll procure. I'll cultivate that mountain there with Hibernian manure. All right, so that kind of got me thinking a little bit after finding these songs. One of the notes on one of the entries for the school's collection says that this man McMahon died in 1837, which is fairly early on. Now that's pre Gortamore, and that's before the famine. So I'm not 100% if that's accurate. I just have a feeling that it might be a bit later than that, because 1837 seems a bit early on for this kind of a song. Well, yeah. Anyway, after thinking a little bit about adverts and local balladeers, local poets and songwriters being employed by companies to sell their products, I kind of thought this can't be a one-off. This definitely can't be a one-off. There's got to be a few more of these. If it's a way people are going to make money, it's going to be regularly utilized as a way for poets and balladeers to make a bit of money for themselves. So the past few weeks I've been trying to research adverts, old ballads that are essentially adverts or placed products or embedded adverts, as they're called today. And I couldn't actually find that many of them, less than I thought. Now, so I then went off and I looked into a bit of the actual history of embedded advertising, and the idea of product placing or embedding an advert within another medium didn't really exist at the time. It's the kind of thing that kind of came into being during the early radio and early times of early radio and early television, even to the point where any academic resources that I looked at to try and find information on this, they only considered radio and television as medium that could possibly have embedded adverts in it. And I kind of want to use this podcast to challenge that a little bit, because the broadside ballad definitely was a medium for embedded adverts. There were lots and lots of little penny songbooks, penny song sheets that were sold that were a full song that might have one or two lines about a local product, a local ale, usually beers or whiskies or ales or something of that nature, but not always. And the more I kind of looked into this, the more I kind of realized this looks to be something that's a bit overlooked by all the media studies people. So from a little bit of research that I've done, generally the first recognized placed products within media, embedded adverts, whatever you'd like to call them, was by possibly, and it's not even 100% sure that he was paid for it, but Jules Verne, the great novelist of the 19th century, during his lifetime was very famous, was extremely famous. Jules Verne was, and it was at the point where like transport companies and shipping companies had known that he was writing and publishing his book 80 around the world in 80 days, and many of them lobbied him, openly asked him to be mentioned in the story for posterity, which makes sense if you're an international shipping company and your book is, your company is mentioned in what is going to be the biggest selling book of the year. That's great exposure for you. That's the type of advertising that today we take for granted, but back then it would have been a very novel sort of new idea. So it's not known for sure if he actually received money for mentioning some of the companies that he does in Around the World in 80 Days, but it's generally accepted by media studies people that was one of the first examples of embedded media. After that, there's a painting by a French painter. I assume he's French actually, Edouard Manet, um, which is a painting of a woman standing at a bar. It's quite well known within advertising circles because of this. Um, and at the bar, the woman's standing up. There's a bunch of bottles there, and one of them is a bottle of Bass beer. Um, but Bass an ale that was built but was brewed in the east of England. It was very, very big company at the time. In the mid 1800s, Bass were absolutely huge. They kind of got really big, and they made their money by following the expansion of the railways that were being built by the British Empire at the time. So their biggest kind of market, one of their biggest markets, was in India during the time of mass colonization of the Indian subcontinent by the British Empire. The Irish were not alone at this time in these kinds of in this kind of adverse treatment by the British Empire. But yeah, Bass, like in a very short space of time, by focusing on their exports to India, where a huge growing colonizing population was of English speaking empire types, managed to do pretty well for themselves. They grew their company, they grew their breweries to very, very large size. I've actually explored one of the old Bass maltings sites, which is in Kings Lynn, which I did a bit of urban exploration there about 15 years ago, and it was massive. The money behind some of these big companies back in the 1800s, when they were monopolies from the get-go. When a company like Bass didn't have many big competitors when it came to exporting beer all over the world. Basically, they were kind of unlimited in their growth in potential markets, really. But and we kind of see that kind of follows a story. Like the company Bass have a long history in advertising now, and it was quite interesting to learn all of this. So one of the first interesting things I found out about Bass was first of all was they pioneered the use of placed products in an art form. They paid a French painter to stick a bottle of one of their beers in one of his paintings, with the label clearly visible, so anyone could identify exactly what it was, which was very genius at the time. I do have to say, I've got quite a lot of respect for whoever came up with that idea. It was a big risk. And the second to that as well is Bass. It basically invented the concept of trademark, because they grew so big so quickly over multiple continents. One thing that was a big problem for the company was counterfeiting. There was quite a lot of people in England, Ireland, India, everywhere that they were selling their beer. People were just slapping on labels, just like putting on their own labels that they'd made that looked like the Bass ones. So what they did is they'd lobbied, and they'd actually created laws in Britain that govern copyright. Sorry, no, not copyright. Trademarking, not copyright. These are two things that are very similar, but very, very different in application. They pretty much pioneered trademarking. Bass's logo is a red triangle, and this triangle is what they trademarked as to symbolize that this is our brewery, this is our product, because they had so much problems with people counterfeiting their stuff, and there was no way for them to go after them. So with a law against trademarking, then they then could go after anyone that is using their registered trademarks. So I thought that was very, very interesting, and I did not know that at all. I had no idea. I'm just going to read out a quick excerpt from a book that I was reading on this topic. It was on the market. I found a textbook about the marketing of alcohol during the Victorian era. There was an interesting passage specifically about Bass IPA and the trademark associated to it. So The red triangle or pyramid and the red diamond were in fact the first British company trademarks to be registered under the Trademarks Registration Act. This is in 1842. This is before Angkor Moor, before the famine. Bass was aware of the need to protect the brand identity and the company, and kept a label book which contained various Bass labels and those used by rival companies. This book contained labels from 1870 to 1924, which appeared to have been used as a means of keeping record of all the development of new product labeling, and also attempts by rival companies to copy Bass's branding. So they went through great efforts to protect their branding and to protect their company image and the image of their products, which was well ahead of their time. To be fair to them, now, this wasn't how business normally ran anywhere in the world in the middle 1800s, which is very, very interesting. And so, with Bass making such public spectacles and protecting their brand image, the company did a lot to kind of dissuade fraudulent activity regarding its products, and at the same time sent out a very clear message to its consumers that Bass Beer was a reputable company, and that they cared about selling high quality products, because they very visibly spent a lot of time and money protecting their products. So, to a consumer, that looks great. That looks like a brand that I can rely on. If this company is going out of their way to remove harmful fake products from the market, then looking for that red triangle is probably a good idea if you're a typical ale or a typical beer consumer. Now, I'd love to say that I've found an old ballad advertising Bass beer from the 1800s, but I couldn't find any. I do suspect that multiple will exist, because in the way that the company has continually sort of reached out to every media as possible to really, really push its branding. I'd be very, very surprised if they never commissioned any broadsides or ballads to be written. I will keep looking. I will keep searching for that, because I do fully expect that multiple ballads extolling the properties of Bass IPA or Bass Stout, whatever they were making at the time, I'm sure they exist. And if I do find them, I will come back to this and mention it to you again. So, with regard to Bass, one other thing they're well known for in Ireland, particularly amongst kind of trad circles, is they sponsored the Dubliners back in the early 70s. In the 1970s, they actually they paid the Dubliners to do an advert for them for the television, which is not bad as adverts go, to be honest. It's a little it's a little cover of a 30-second cover of Rocky Road. The boys land in a plane, and they get off at the airport, jump into a taxi, and make their way to a Dublin pub, O'Donoghue's, on Merrion Row. I've no idea if it still exists or not anymore. But they all go in, have a few pints, and they sing Rocky Road to Dublin, but with the words changed to be all about Bass. I'll play it now for you, because it's worth having a listen to. It's quite funny just to hear the Dubliners doing a little advert like that. It's very cheesy, and also because I'm criticising it and because I'm reviewing it in the context, I don't have to worry about copyright strikes here. So anyway, here's the famous Bass advert featuring the Dubliners. Feeling good to be back home with all the smiles, saving up the third for 3,000 miles, twice the farmer's board. Before and Dallas Bass before, joining in the chorus, never a beer for sure. I've been real so pure, taste the soul, sure you taste the real beer flavor, Bass is satisfying. A thirst and so dry, and here's the rose and white, it has a smoother flavor. That's Bass. That's some dreadful audio quality. I do apologise for that, but I think the original must have been recorded on a tin can or something like that. That's I tried to scrub it up as best as I could, but that's the best that I could do. But can you imagine that got sent out on TV? That was the quality of sound recording back in the early 1970s. Amazing, isn't it? Anyway, Ronnie Drew, what a legend. So the next ballad I'm going to play for you now, it's another one advertising a stout ale, Dwyer's Stout Ale. I doubt any of you have ever heard of that before. Dwyer's Stout Ale used to be made and sold in a pub in Banshire in Tipperary. This would have been mid 1800s. So I think 1853, I think, was when this one was written. I don't have it in front of me at the moment. But yeah, this is Dwyer's Stout Ale, and it's written by a very important bard from Tipperary called Darby Ryan. Now, Darby Ryan is another one I'm definitely going to do a deep dive into Darby Ryan. He alone is worth several podcasts. I could fill several podcasts talking about Darby Ryan, which I'm going to at some point. But I got a hold of one of his songbooks. Darby Ryan was a very, very important and very famous balladeer from the Gortamora era, from the famine era. His most famous song is very well known among trad circles and around the world today. It's the Peeler and the Goat, which is a great tune, kind of taking the piss out of the local police, enforcing penal laws that were enacted in Ireland at the time. It's the Peeler and the Goat is it's a big and an important tune, not just for the ballad itself, but the air to Peeler and the Goat is one that's been used and reused for many songs ever since. Most famously, the Recruiting Sergeant is probably the most well-known air of Peeler and the Goat, besides the Peeler and the Goat itself. So this one is Darby Ryan. He's obviously been commissioned by the Dwyer's pub in Banshire to write this. Darby Ryan was from Banshire himself. He's buried there at the moment. I visited his grave actually a few weeks ago. So the Dwyers of that area of Tipperary at that time were quite big landowners. They were the descendants of Gaelic chieftains since kind of before colonial times, and they'd held on to possession of a few castles and quite a lot of the lands around this area. I actually live very close to one of the Dwyer's castles, so they would have been a very influential, very wealthy family, particularly at the time. So I'm going to play that now. This one is Dwyer's Stout Ale, and I've tried throwing in a bowron there. I don't know how good I am at playing the bowron, but it sounds okay to me. So let me know anyway. This is Dwyer's Stout Ale by Darby Ryan. Near the town of Sweetstep, there's a neat little village called Banshire. You may go by rail. Great place for increasing mankind and for tillage. It's there you'll prove fruitful with Dwyer's Stout Ale. If you meet there, be able and willing to drink of that cup and be sure not to fail. If your expenses be there but 1 shilling to drink, plenty of Dwyer's Stout Ale. It is a refreshment to them that is crossic. You'll give circulation and vent to the blood. Stiff rheumatic joints, it will make them elastic, brisk, nimble and hearty as eels in the mud. It bestows on the coward the courage of Hector, the feeble it renders stout, hearty and hale. It makes all their years as long genial as nectar, such powers are censured in Dwyer's Stout Ale. It is better than port, Madeira or sherry, cognac, brandy and even champagne. Guinness is stout or old cock whiskey, such is the strength of Dwyer's Stout Ale. The farmer, the tradesman, the indignant spadesman, the delicate lady as well as the male, the ploughman, the placeman, the pensioner, statesman, and show their probation for Dwyer's Stout Ale. Okay, I had to kind of wing the air for that one because I couldn't find any information on what the air was supposed to be. So that was Dwyer's Stout Ale, again by Darby Ryan. Darby Ryan, remember that name. He's definitely someone I'm going to come back to. Like I say, he was extremely prolific, and he had some really, really big hits and a lot of really interesting kind of cool ballads that weren't big hits that I'd like to kind of share as well. His writing was really, really good. Like, some of his ballads are some of the best I've ever read or seen before, and I'm really looking forward to sharing a few more of those in the future. So keep an eye out for that. The next one I'm going to play is another little ballad. It's another advert. This is from the 1960s for an Irish beer, an Irish lager called Phoenix Beer. This is set in Malachai's Select Bar in Dublin, and it's kind of just a little. It's like a little 30 seconds ditty based on an old style ballad. It's not a classical ballad or anything like that. It's something that's been written for the advert, but I kind of liked it, so I thought it'd be nice to put in here, seeing as we've already got quite a few songs about different beers, ranging for, from the early 1800s up until the 1970s, and I think it's a good little addition for you. So this is the music from an advert for Phoenix Beer.
I dream of Phoenix with a bright pleasant flare, rich satisfaction, taste beyond compare. I watch enchanted where its bright streams play, envy every tankard that bears it away. Many golden Phoenix these bones have in store, fragrant overheads that will cover them more.
Mr. O.
I sigh for Phoenix, just have and see. Why its strength and flavor make it Phoenix for me.
All these songs about beer are making me a bit thirsty, I gotta say. So that was an old 60s ballad for Phoenix Beer. So the general takeaway from kind of studying this for the past couple of weeks are two things, really. First of all, there's a very, very long tradition of Irish ballads and Irish music advertising beer and various forms of alcohol. And the second takeaway as well, I'd like to hear some opinions on this one, actually. I'm tempted to actually contact a few academics that work, that study advertising, and ask what's going on there, because every single resource that I looked at to learn about embedded media and product placement, none of them considered broadsides or ballads as a medium to consider for advertising. And I'd like first of all to find out exactly why that is, and dispute that, because very, very clearly, as evidenced today, we have Irish ballads that date back to the early 1800s that are paid adverts for products and embedded media. So I think that's one I would like to look into. If anybody is an academic and anybody does study media, please get in touch and explain that one to me. I'll make a few inquiries myself over the next couple of weeks, just to find out what the crack is with that, really, because I mean, it could easily be something that's just never been considered in that field, and if it is, maybe it's something that should be considered. Because I'm just, I'm not an academic. I don't have the resources that people in universities do, and if I can find multiple examples of embedded media in old Irish ballads, then there's definitely lots more, and they certainly are going to exist in England and in Scotland and America as well. So it'd be interesting to see what the crack is with that and why the media people have overlooked this. It kind of feels like a way too big of a medium to overlook, to be honest. Because like I said, literally every resource that I researched about this was just claiming that the painting of the bottle of Bass in the Frenchman's painting that we spoke about earlier, most of them referred to that as the first placed product in an advert, and all of their kind of descriptions start at early radio, which is radio is a very interesting one actually for Ireland, because we don't have old radio adverts in this country, because when radio was first set up in this country, there were no commercial radio stations. They were illegal. Only the government could broadcast. And from what I understand, it was not commercial. It wasn't commercial in nature. Now, that's not to say that there weren't adverts on early radio, but I think the advertisers and marketers had to be a lot more sneaky in how they got them in there. So that's something I'm going to look into as well at a later date. That could, depending on what I find, that could be another podcast entirely talking about early radio adverts, where songs of snuck in endorsements for products and got under the censor's radar up in Dublin, which is quite interesting. So I have one more that I'm going to share with you and leave you. This one is not about beer, but it is an old one. It's pre-1930s. There was no date attached to this one. Again, it's from the school's collection. I'll read out the entry. The following verses were taken from an old advertisement for the products of an old woolen factory in Brown Castle in County Wexford. So the school's collection is 1937-ish, the years before and after 1937. And if it's described as an old advert of an old woolen factory in 1937, so it's probably a good bit older than that. So this is very likely going to be late 1800s, I suspect. I'd like to find out, again, if anyone anyone in Wexford has ever heard of Brown Castle, the woolen factory. That'd be very interesting. I must admit, I didn't even look into it. I just liked the look of the ballad, and I thought I'd stick it on the podcast there. So this is Brown Castle, an advert for the old woolen factory in Brown Castle, County Wexford. I, Edmund Fortune, say to all who at the woolen factory will call, that I to them a suit can sell, which I shall warrant to wear well. My prices too are very low, a fine assortment I can show, and one thing I had quite forgotten, that in my wool you'll find no cotton. And more than all I've said, I've rugs and blankets to fit the bed, and that there may be no mistake, a second price I never make. So that's Edward Fortune, I assume, either paid for that or wrote that himself, so I can only presume that he's the proprietor of the Brown Castle woolen factory. Again, if anyone knows of any fortunes in Wexford, do get in touch. It'd be very interesting. It could be a distant relation, a distant ancestor of yours that wrote that, and I'd be interested to see what happened to the mill as well. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up at that. I had a few others, but I think I'm going to come back to this advertising theme again, because there's actually a lot more here to explore than I previously thought. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. We've gone past the half-an-hour mark. Thank you very much for tuning in again and listening to me. It's all very, very, very appreciated. This week, what I am going to do is I had a few recordings that I've put into this podcast, and I'm gonna splice them and put them up to listen individually as well. That's gonna go on the Patreon, not for patrons, for anyone. You don't have to subscribe to the Patreon to access any of this. But if you do feel like subscribing to the Patreon, that is very, very welcomed. I'm a new podcaster. I would like to sustain this. I'd like to keep doing this for the indefinite future, because I really, really enjoy looking into these songs and discussing them with you and sharing them. So if you do appreciate what I'm doing, if you do see value in it, if you met me down the pub, if you'd buy me a pint, do consider subscribing, $5 a month. It really does help. So you can find that at patreon.com/bauldbill, BAULDBILL. There's plenty of links. I've put this link on pretty much everything that I'm uploading at the moment. I'm also Bald Bill on Instagram as well, so do feel free to give us a follow and give us a message. It's always great to hear opinions on what I'm doing. There's one thing I'm finding quite difficult about doing a podcast and putting it out there is you don't get the kind of immediate reaction that I'm used to getting from playing gigs or playing to live audiences or speaking to people in kind of real life. You can kind of judge based on their reactions how well it's received, and that's completely absent in podcasting. And it's one thing I'm not exactly struggling with, but I'm kind of finding it a new thing for me that I'm sure I'll get past. And the more this grows, the more people hear it, I'm sure the more feedback that I'll get. So please do get in touch, give me your thoughts. If there's anything you'd in particular like me to look into in a future episode as well, I'm always taking requests. Like, I have got a lot of ideas. I've probably got about 10 or 12 podcasts that I've more or less got planned out, over the next couple of weeks. I'm going to stick to the twice a month schedule for the time being, because it gives me time to properly research things. I don't want to rush. I don't want to rush researching things. I like to kind of finish most of the work in 1 week and then kind of leave it for a week before finally recording it and uploading it, just in case I discover anything else that's immediately of interest and immediately relevant to the podcast, which often happens after you've done a week of research on something. Something else might pop up the next day or the day after that, and I kind of don't want to be left finalizing a podcast, and then the next day I find an amazing ballad that would have perfectly fitted that podcast. So every 2 weeks kind of suits me for that reason. So anyway, I've been Bell Bill, your host for the Lost Songs of Ireland podcast. This is episode number 4 now, and I'm delighted so far with the work that I've put out. I hope you are as well. Thanks very much for tuning in. I massively appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your days, and we'll see you in the next one.